Chapter 9. Orrin Porter Rockwell. But having been the vortex of controversy while he lived, it seems, somehow, only fitting that the same would be true after his passing. Rockwell's past has been distorted to incredible extremes by writers on two continents who transformed his name into a synonym for terror. Harold Schindler, preface to Orrin Porter Rockwell. Orrin Porter Rockwell was a scout, pioneer, frontiersman, and a deputy marshal. His life and career became widely known by friend and foe throughout his colorful life. Only the Wild West could contain such a man desperately needed in that era of time. His was an adventurous life, and an antagonistic one, as every lawman well knows. Lawless gunmen feared him, citizens were comforted by his presence. If he had not been a Mormon, he would have been considered not only as one of their best friends, but as one of the most famous Western heroes in America. The Wells Fargo Company hired him many times to protect their stage lines from outlaws or to capture one who had robbed them. The railroad often employed him for the same reasons. Private shippers and freighters relied on Porter's uncanny skill at finding rustlers and thieves. He gave little thought to a person's religious or social status when he was employed to capture some criminal. Tourists, journalists, or people needing a lawman were always inquiring, "Where is Porter Rockwell?" He became a notorious gunfighter that would have filled an extensive television series with plenty of saga lore. Writers would have little need to look for fiction for fill-in. Porter was described as a medium-sized man with a forehead partly bald, but had long grizzly hair. His eyes were steel blue with shaggy eyebrows, but gave him a rather aboriginal look. Nearly everyone agreed that he was jovial and good-natured, but he possessed a devil-may-care outlook on life. Few doubted his fearlessness or his uncanny ability to follow a trail like a bloodhound. At first look, he had a powerful and sometimes fearful appearance, but his nature was gracious and respected, often bursting out in jovial laugh. His strength and tremendous endurance in capturing criminals was a matter of record. Like other notable men of their time, Porter filled an important and noteworthy position on the rugged frontier of the Utah Territory. It is doubtful if any other person of the time could have filled the needed and necessary part that destiny had marked for him. Early history. While Porter was a young boy of 16, he became one of the church's first converts. Even at that young age, he was ardently fond of Joseph Smith, the prophet, and often worked to scrape together a few pennies which he contributed towards the publication of the Book of Mormon. Porter was a comparatively young man through all the scenes of mobbing, driving, plundering, and murder that were brought upon the Mormon people. It was then that these formidable impressions gave him a respect for law and order, and a dispassionate hatred of cruel and wicked acts of men. From New York, where the church began, to the vast territory of Utah, Porter learned many lessons and had some of the most varied experiences of any other man in the church. Porter witnessed the vile and mean nature that can infuse itself into the character of some men, both by his seeing what they do to others and by suffering their indignities himself. For example, a band of Missouri raiders, stripped to the waist and smeared with paint like Indians, came looking for Porter at his mother's home one night. Visibly shaken by the sight which confronted her, Mrs. Rockwell told the raiders she was home alone with the children. Hot words passed between several men in the party. "We are wasting time. Pull the house down, and let's be on with it," shouted one. "No, we'll catch him on our way back," snapped another, apparently the leader. With a final insult to Rockwell's mother and his sister Electra, the marauders vanished into the night. Both Porter's home and that of his father were surrounded by whooping riders. Quickly, in the manner of men experienced in their work, they looped ropes over the eaves of the two squat log buildings and, tying the ends to saddle pommels, spurred their horses forward. A wrenching crack, like a breaking limb, and the father's cabin was unroofed, its bare walls standing shamefully, obscenely, violated in the moonlight. No sooner had the sound died away than the second roof came crashing to the ground. Luana Rockwell, frightened nearly out of her wits, huddled in a corner of the dwelling, while Miss Saurians pulled her possessions from the house. Next door, Electra implored the men not to destroy their household goods. A knife flashed from its scabbard, blade glittering. "Get the hell from underfoot, or it's this across the throat," hissed a painted figure. Orrin Porter Rockwell, Schindler, page 28. As Porter endured, with many other saints, the constant mobbing, moving, and persecutions, he became uncompassionate towards these ruffians who plundered without being touched by the law. He soon became affected by the tears and cries of his people, and turning the other cheek, soon was eliminated from Porter's mental and emotional character. It was not so much who was suffering, or who was guilty. Porter considered the committing of cruel or heartless acts among the worst of all evils. Many assassins trying to get Joseph Smith ran into Porter, Joseph's bodyguard. It was a peculiar twist in men's minds that caused them to interfere with others who wanted to worship differently. Men in high political office, such as Lilburn W. Boggs, governor of Missouri, not only failed to give protection to the Mormons, but signed an order to have them expelled from the state. When Boggs was shot, he swore out a complaint against Joseph Smith as the instigator and Porter as the trigger man. When Joseph heard about it, he said that if Porter had gone to do the job, he wouldn't have missed. Porter was arrested nearly a year later and was taken to Independence, Missouri, on the charge of attempted murder of Governor Boggs. When he arrived, a crowd gathered, and someone brought a rope with the intention of hanging Porter. A tree was selected and Porter was brought up to it. However, something happened and after some consultation it was decided not to hang him. He was taken to trial, and they could not find sufficient evidence to bring a verdict against him, but for some reason, he spent the next 9 months in jail anyway. His wrists were chained to his ankles as if he were a dangerous animal. In ragged clothes without an opportunity to shave or cut his hair, it was not long until he must have resembled some wild creature. 9 months of hair growth on a man like Porter presented quite a show, and he must have enjoyed it, for he never volunteered to cut it off the rest of his life. Port had a flair for the dramatic. Porter Rockwell, the Mormon frontier marshal, page 26. Porter finally escaped from jail with a mob chasing after him. He traveled as far as 25 miles a night, not stopping at any homes for fear of being betrayed. He walked for 11 days in winter weather without adequate clothing or shoes, and finally arrived in Nauvoo, December 24, 1843. At the mansion house, Joseph Smith was having a reception and entertaining guests on Christmas Eve. Then walked Porter among the socialites, looking like a spectacle from a dungeon, which he was. It was Porter's way of having fun. He wanted to see how long his identity would be a secret. To make his presence more repugnant, he acted like a drunk. Someone commented to Joseph about this unsavory visitor, and so he went over to usher out the uninvited guest. As Joseph put his hand on the drunk man's shoulder, he caught his eye and recognized Porter, quickly grasping and hugging his long-departed friend. Tears of happiness flooded the faces of both men. It was about this time that Joseph promised Porter that if he would never cut his hair, he would never die at the hands of his enemies. It was another prophecy and a slim chance of being fulfilled. On the evening of June 22, 1844, Joseph Smith came to Porter asking him if he would be willing to go on a long journey out west. Rockwell said he would go with him any place. They left the next morning on a little boat across the river onto the Iowa side, with Hiram and Willard Richards. They were going out west, and the rest of the saints could follow. Porter had to get some other things needed for the journey, but when he returned he had a message from Emma. She indicated that many of the saints were accusing Joseph of cowardice by running away to leave the others to face the mobs. Joseph replied that if his life was of no value to his friends, it was of no value to him. There was a moment of deep contemplation. Joseph turned to Porter and asked, "What shall I do?" To which Porter replied, "You are the oldest and know what is best." Joseph decided to go back to Nauvoo to face the charges. On the way, Joseph walked beside Porter and said, "It is of no use to hurry, for we are going back to be killed." When Joseph was in the Carthage jail, he sent word to Porter to stay in Nauvoo and avoid being captured again. Later, Porter met Francis M. Higbee on the street in Nauvoo and accused Francis of trying to take the life of the prophet. There were some heated words, a scuffle in the street, and both Higbee's hat and a letter concealed inside fell to the ground. Porter picked it up and took it with him, reading that 70 members of a mob were across the river, preparing to make a raid on Nauvoo that night. It was just enough warning that the saints could make a quick defense. Higbee, the apostate, had aligned himself with the mobbers, which seemed to be the natural course for all apostates thereafter. During the fateful afternoon of June 27, when Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were killed, Porter went to the upper room of the mansion house to get his hat. When he opened the door, he saw Governor Ford of Illinois tallying to some of the militia officers. He was standing behind a chair and bringing his hand down on the chair. He said, "The deed is done by now." Everyone looked as surprised to see Porter come in as he was to see them there. The full impact of what was said didn't hit Porter until later that afternoon, when he heard the news of the prophet's death. Ford had deliberately left Carthage to expose Joseph to a mob to do their murderous killing. Porter left Nauvoo for Carthage, but on the way he saw a Mormon rushing towards him on a buckboard with a gang of men after him. He shouted to Porter that he had just witnessed the massacre at Carthage, and the mob was now after him. Porter and Belknap dismounted and fired at the mob, which quickly turned them back in the direction from where they had come. Returning to Nauvoo, Porter came to the house where the prophet's son, Joseph, was standing in the doorway. He looked at him and began to sob. "Oh, Joseph, they have killed the only friend I ever had." His statement was similar to that of Lyman White, who had been referred to as a wild ram of the mountains. When he heard of Joseph's death, he bellowed, "The only man who could control me is dead." Porter was, like Joseph Smith, usually sought by the law for some trumped-up charge by anti-Mormons. The whole affair was never considered very seriously by Porter, and in spite of the seriousness of it all, he never lost his sense of humor. One day a posse was sent to arrest Rockwell. During the day some of these men were having their noon meal at the Nauvoo mansion, while others were outside keeping a vigil for Porter. The news spread that another hunt was on for Port, and a large crowd had gathered. Presently a carriage was driven rapidly up to the mansion house. The driver climbed down and opened the door, and a woman stepped out. She was dressed in a black drawl with a bonnet, and had a veil covering her face. She went through the crowd and up the stairway into the house. After a few minutes she returned and entered the carriage again and was hurriedly driven away. It was soon circulated among the Mormons that it was Porter. He loved antics of this kind. Porter Rockwell, The Mormon Frontier Marshal, pages 52 to 53. Joseph Smith's death did little to prevent mobs and cutthroats from their constant devilry against the Mormon people. These mobocrats would join together, as though they were engaged in some form of sport, and attack Mormon homes in the night. House burning was a familiar game to them, and they dubbed themselves wolf hunters. During this time a new sheriff had been appointed in Hancock County. He was an honorable man who respected the law, and believed that law was intended to protect everyone, even Mormons. On September 10, 1845, the wolf hunters came to an area called Green Plains where they began burning homes, eventually totaling about 125. The new sheriff, Jacob Backenstos, made a proclamation for this outrage to stop, or he would get a posse and stop it. The mobs continued their nefarious deeds in spite of the warning, and Backenstos could find no one who would help him in a posse. He went to Nauvoo where he obtained a number of volunteers, but with other tactics, they turned on the sheriff, and he was forced to leave or die. But even his leaving was not enough. They laid plans to kill him anyhow. As Backenstos was leaving in a buggy, he noticed that a mob was following him. He speeded up his departure with the mob close behind. At this time Porter and a friend, John Redding, were seated on an old railroad crossing when they heard the buggy approaching. They turned to see Backenstos approaching and yelling for help. Porter replied, "Let them come. We have rifles and revolvers." The sheriff shouted for the mob to halt, but they came right on, with guns raised. The sheriff told Porter to shoot. He raised his gun and took aim and fired at the leader, resulting in the death of Frank Worrell. The mob turned and left, later to come back for the body. Worrell had been an officer of the Carthage Greys, one of the fake guards at the Carthage jail when Joseph was killed. Why this incident was allowed to remain without action being taken for 8 months is not known. But finally another arrest order was out for Porter. He was taken in and placed in jail for another 4 months. When his trial came up, there was no conviction because no one testified against him. On the western frontier, Porter left to join the pioneers going west on August 16, 1846. From this crucible of 1,700 miles and 20 years there emerged in the Mormon Church the poets, the musicians, the philosophers, the preachers, the prophets, the cynics, the agnostics, the organizers, the apostates, the meek, the critics, and Porter Rockwell. Porter Rockwell, The Mormon Frontier Marshal, page 16. On March 12, 1849, in the first public election held in the Great Salt Lake Valley, Porter Rockwell took office as the deputy marshal for the provisional state of Deseret. Men used for building up God's kingdom are not always missionaries like Paul or Alma. God often uses a Joshua, a Gideon, or a Samson, and Porter fell into this camp. He was never called as a missionary, and there are few records of his church activities. His labors occupied so much of his time, he did not enjoy a family life as most men. Neither was he found active in the church for the same reason. Porter's talents were important in developing the western frontier, nursemaiding wagon trains, protecting settlements from Indians and outlaws, regaining stolen cattle or goods, capturing killers and outlaws, and establishing law and order were as important as any other efforts in God's kingdom. Both Porter's home and business were mostly riding in a saddle. He was one of the first to enter the valley and made many similar trips to help other settlers who followed. He made several trips to California to buy cattle, horses, or wheat. On another occasion he went to California to escort some of the Mormon battalion men to Utah. His wagon train was also the first to make the southern route from California. Rockwell was empowered to make contracts and purchase and transport goods for the church. He was not a literate person, but there were only a few at that time who were. Often he would escort missionaries across the frontier. When mail service had become a near disaster, it was Porter who took the run from Salt Lake City to Fort Laramie to help it become a success. Porter, Rockwell, and two other riders frantically rode into the Salt Lake Valley on July 24, 1857, with the alarming news that a Federal Army train with 400 wagons was on its way to Utah. They were coming out west to put down a Mormon rebellion. The whole story, like many others that had aroused animosity in the East, was hatched up by the pen of one man. Judge W.W. Drummond wrote a false report to President Buchanan, who acted upon this rumor rather than obtain the facts for himself. It would prove to be one of the most costly and embarrassing episodes of Buchanan's entire life and career. Brigham Young attempted to make preparations for the worst because an army of misinformed soldiers could easily lead to a situation that would get out of hand. He wanted no bloodshed, but he would put up a defense. Liars have reported that this people have committed treason, and upon their representations the president has ordered out troops to assist in officering the territory. We have transgressed no law, neither do we intend to do so, but as for any nation coming to destroy this people, God Almighty being my helper, it shall not be. Mormonism, Americanism, and Politics, R. Vitterly, page 403. The first thing Brigham did was to send Apostle Samuel Richards to Washington, D.C., with an appeal for the president to thoroughly investigate the rumors before bringing any acts of war against the Mormon people. Bancroft said that the government's expedition was the best equipped army force assembled in the United States. President Buchanan justified his actions this way. Almost as soon as Buchanan became president, the conflict over slavery began to assume dangerous proportions, and throughout his administration, he was in terror of being forced to civil war. By sending troops to Utah, Buchanan wished to demonstrate to the southern states that the federal government would not countenance rebellion. Buchanan said, "This is the first rebellion which has existed in our territories, and humanity itself requires that we should put it down in such a manner that it shall be the last." Works of James Buchanan, Vol. 10 154. Reports came back to the Mormons that the army intended to make war. It could mean more devastation than any mob had ever caused. One report said, "The United States are sending 2,500 infantry, besides Colonel Sumner's dragoons, which are to rendezvous in Great Salt Lake City this winter, 100 teamsters, the worst description of men, picked up on the frontiers, which are more to be dreaded than the soldiers. They are making great calculations for booty and beauty." Perrow Historical Record, August 7, 1857. On the other hand, Brigham Young was taking a much milder approach to the situation. He wanted no war nor bloodshed. Blockade the road, set fire to their trains, burn the whole country before them, keep them from sleeping, but take no life, Brigham ordered. What a different attitude than that of the President of the United States. Who was the war maker? Who proposed to shed blood? Who acted in haste, without reason or responsibility, and was taking a savage stand against innocent people? The Mormons were preparing for the strangest war in military history. It demonstrated the regard the Mormons had for the lives of men, even soldiers. They were not, as a people, bloodthirsty savages, nor were they the kind who would sanction a Mountain Meadows massacre or establish bands of marauders to wreak vengeance upon unsuspecting innocent people. This war portrays by their attitude and their actions that not only was the U.S. Army wrong for its offensive action, but also the army of authors, apostates, and anti-Mormon elements that had howled so hard and for so long. Porter Rockwell, Bill Hickman, and Major Lot Smith acted as a guerrilla force, independent of the large force of the Nauvoo Legion. One of the first actions of the campaign was a strange incident involving Porter Rockwell that became a humorous tale often told around the campfire of both sides. Orrin Porter Rockwell was a Mormon meteor for night riding, and he sped eastward on the Emigrant Trail for Fort Bridger, ahead of Lot Smith, with a cruising party, reaching Pacific Springs, while the remnant of Colonel Alexander's 10th Infantry were there with the beef cattle and the corn train, according to Captain Ginn. Rockwell adroitly crept behind the night guard and stampeded the mules. For the moment it seemed as if the disappearing mules had suddenly recognized their ancestry as tracing to Balaam's ass, but when the wild clatter of hoofs ceased about 3 miles down the road, the stable call was ordered by the buglers. The mules heard the call, recognized it as a call to feed, and came galloping back, bringing with them the entire Mormon mount with empty saddles. Jim Bridger, by J. Cecil Alter. But this wasn't the end of that story. It appears that Rockwell and his merry band of men sought another camp to steal some horses. They came near the camp of the 10th Infantry and saw some 15 horses all saddled and bridled, as though they were ready for an alert or a maneuver. They stole them successfully and rode back to the Big Sandy. In the morning they were surprised to learn they had stolen the horses from another Mormon scouting group. But soon the events would turn about to their favor. Near Ham's Fork the government had a large herd of cattle. Gathering 100 men, the Mormon raiders headed for a huge cattle-rustling venture that could turn the tide of the war. Without beef for winter, the expedition could face starvation. When they reached the herd, they found only a few men guarding the cattle, so the Mormon brigade roared down the slopes with war whoops that would have frightened any Indian camp. The boys then gave a shout, such as imported steers never heard before, and the latter started away pell-mell, trotting many of the poorer under their hooves, and killing half a dozen of them. The guards were frightened as badly as the cattle and looked pale as death. Contributor 448. As the Mormon force passed by some of the sentries, Rockwell turned in his saddle and shouted to the one of them that he knew. "You, Roop, when you get to camp, tell Colonel Alexander that we've stopped playing games. We'll kill every damn blue coat in his command unless he turns our men loose. Do you hear me, Roop?" Lotsmith laughed at Porter and related. The guards then started for camp. They were the worst frightened men I ever saw. They ran the 3 teams until some of the cattle dropped dead, but they never stopped until they got within the lines. Contributor 449. From here the little band of warriors racked up several more victories, capturing the enemy's wagon trains, taking what they wanted, leaving just enough supplies for their prisoners, and then burning their wagons. On one of these raids, they overtook a camp with none other than Wild Bill Hickok and Buffalo Bill Cody. It was Cody that later told the whole embarrassing affair and penned, "The strange horsemen had surrounded us. They were all armed with double-barreled shotguns, rifles, and revolvers. We also were armed with revolvers, but we had had no idea of danger, and these men, much to our surprise, had got the drop on us and had covered us with their weapons so that we were completely at their mercy. The whole movement of corralling us was done so quietly and quickly that it was accomplished before we knew it." The Great West, by Charles Needer, page 225. The army soldiers were put on rations. Occasionally a Mormon command would send in some salt or other necessary provisions to sustain them until spring. Of this incident Senator Sam Houston spoke to the Senate by saying, "An act of civility was tendered by Brigham Young, and you might, if you please, construe it under the circumstances rather as an act of submission. He sent salt to the troops, understanding it was scarce there, and was selling it $7 a pint. As an act of humanity, thinking at least that it could not be regarded as discourteous, he sent a supply of salt for the relief of the encampment, intimating to the commander that he could pay for it, if he would not accept it as a present." What was the message the military officer sent him back? I believe that the substance of it was that he would have no intercourse with a rebel, and that when they met they would fight. They will fight, and if they fight, he will get miserably whipped. That was the time to make peace with Brigham Young. But instead of that, he sent them a taunt and a defiance. Congressional Globe, 35th Congress, 1st Session, Vol. XXIV, page 874. General Van Vliet and Colonel Kane decided to take measures themselves to settle things peaceably. They came to Salt Lake City to confer with Brigham Young. Both were reasonable men of good understanding. They could see there was no rebellion and no necessity for troops among the Mormons. They took their message back to General Johnston, who was in charge of the army expedition. Johnston refused any cooperation or peace ventures. He came out here to fight, and that was what he was going to do. Kane actually challenged Johnston to a duel. But nothing occurred any worse than a broken gun over a fence and a lot of shouting. However, the irony of this occasion would again be repeated. Johnston would eventually rebel against the United States in the Civil War, an act of which he falsely accused the Mormons, and Colonel Kane would be a general for the Union fighting against him. The new governor of the territory, Alfred Cumming, came into the valley escorted by Mormons. Reaching Farmington, he was met by a host of Mormons and a band playing the Star-Spangled Banner. In Salt Lake City he was overwhelmed by the reception given him. "Where is the rebellion?" he commented cheerfully. When he asked to see the records of all territorial documents which had been reported burned, he was given complete access to them. To his surprise, everything was in order. The whole expedition had been in vain. Cumming wrote a letter to General Johnston and another to President Buchanan. "I have been everywhere recognized as the governor of Utah, and I have been universally greeted with such respectful attention as are due the representative of the executive authority of the United States. I have been employed in examining the records of the Supreme and District Courts, which I am prepared to report upon as being perfect and unimpaired. I have also examined the legislation records and other books belonging to the Secretary of State, which are in perfect preservation. The books and records have been kept in a most excellent condition. House Executive Documents, 36th Congress, Vol. 272, 93. The war was soon over. All the reports, testimonies, and witnesses against the Mormons became a worthless pile of lies and falsehoods. All the work of the apostates, Mormon haters, and vicious enemies of Brigham Young fell to the dirt where they belonged. How disappointing to all those who wanted the United States to declare war upon the Mormon people. Deputy Marshal Rockwell. From 1848 until his death in 1878, Porter acted as a deputy marshal peace officer of the Utah Territory to keep law and order within the broad range of land that it covered. For the next 30 years he came into contact with every kind of peculiar people that lived or passed through the territory. To perform his duties in that office, he brought many men into the courts for trial and prison, but he also had to kill many men, as other marshals and deputies often, of necessity, had to do. Notwithstanding the reports of his critics, there is no proof that he ever wantonly killed anyone. The Utah Territory had its share of outlaws and desperados, just like the Montana, California, and Texas territories of the West. Crime was common, and life was often cheap in these rough wilderness lands. It was the duty of such men as Porter to meet or challenge the lawbreakers in order to bring law and peace to those who wanted it. Porter is said to have carried on his duties with no more or less callousness and hardness than was necessary in any other region, and correctly so. Porter was a two-gun man, and he could use either with astounding accuracy. His skill as a tracker was said to excel that of the Indians. His courage in facing an enemy was enough to unman his opponents, and many were brought into this showdown. Some of the men who came out west were wanted elsewhere, most commonly for stealing horses. In those days, a horse thief anywhere was considered unworthy to live, and after they were caught, they seldom did. The nearest tree was the closest department of justice. The Utah Territory was not too much different, and to steal a man's horse, in most cases, resulted in death for the thief. Porter spent most of his time and energy in chasing and capturing horse thieves. But after the Johnston Army incident, there was another torrid flow of anti-Mormon literature thrown at the church. It came from both apostates who left the church and from Gentiles who sought to break the church either monetarily or religiously. Some of them went to such extremes that even their own contemporaries had to shake their heads at such ridiculous material. In most of these books and newspapers, Porter Rockwell was named the Destroying Angel, and they declared that his job was to destroy the Gentiles or any Mormons who were out of harmony with Brigham Young. Rockwell is the main character in Charles Kelly's and Hoffman Burney's 1934 edition of Holy Murder. In the same year the book was published, a review came out in the New Republic magazine, which declared the book as a worthless piece of junk, as far as actual history is concerned. For instance, in this book they relate the story of a man who was on a mission for the church, and during his absence, his wife became guilty of an immoral act. When the husband returned, Porter assisted him with the atonement that had to be performed. They took her out behind some nearby trees where the most brutal details of her death were described. They even printed the names and places involved. But when the facts behind the story came to light, it was discovered that the woman had lived 12 years longer than Porter, and when she died, it was from a fall off a carriage. Most of these books were filled with minute details and complete conversations, word for word, that went on between parties, sometimes between only two people, yet no records, nor letters or papers are ever produced for authenticity. Once a man by the name of Fitzhugh Ludlow came to Utah to write his impressions of the saints, and about Porter Rockwell as the Destroying Angel. Porter was always amused with the stories of Mormon horns and his part as the destroyer. When he saw Ludlow straining for hints of truth to the rumor, he would play it up. On one occasion Porter warned Ludlow and his party that they had better stop at his place before they left. Porter threatened them that he would take their horses away and put them in his stable, then he would force them into the house where he would inflict upon them the penalty of a real Mormon dinner. They would be compelled to eat pancakes and sausages. After that, they would be released if they insisted, or they would have to suffer such torture longer. Their release was, of course, only on but we are savage people, we Mormons really torturium awful. With that Porter shook Ludlow's hand, jumped on his horse, and rode off. Ludlow appraised Porter as a religious fanatic and said he operated without rationality. His personal life perhaps showed threads of irrationality much the same as everyone else in greater or lesser degree, but Porter was a peace officer, a deputy sheriff, and he had great respect for the law and very dim view of the criminal. His harsh life represented the balance of such a character. Ludlow marked him as a man of ordinary intelligence, amiable, polite, graceful in manner, with a dash of aristocracy. Nicholas Van Alphen in his book Porter Rockwell, the Mormon Frontier Marshal, quoted Jules Remy and Julius Brenchley who, in 1860, described the inner side of Porter. A man full of heart and greatness, capable of the grandest devotion, ready to sacrifice himself in behalf of anyone who gained his esteem, without regard to sect or person, whether Jews, pagan, Moslems or Mormons. If the blood of heroes can be inferred from the expression of his face and the qualities of his heart, they thought one would swear there were traces of a lofty origin in Porter. If there was a perilous service to be rendered, a crime to be avenged, or a sacrifice to be made for the oppressed, Porter was ever at hand. Pages 138 to 139. A great many instances of Porter's brush with criminals could be listed, but only a few are necessary here. Most critics of Rockwell claim that he was the avenging angel to destroy the Gentiles, but no matter what Porter did or who was involved, it seemed that they made Porter out to be in the wrong. To illustrate, Sam Bennion was a 20-year-old boy who had been employed as a scout or guard for the overland stage. He finally earned enough money to purchase a beautiful well-bred mare. When his father went with the horse to a meeting in Murray, he came out and found the horse gone. Porter was called for, and he and 3 others began to track the animal. They continued south and then over into Cedar Valley into Camp Floyd, and from there to the Faust mail station. They arrived at 4 o'clock in the morning, and Porter asked Sam Bateman to check the stable and see if the horse was there. It was, so the men waited and shivered in the cold until 10 o'clock in the morning. The door opened up and H.J. Faust, the station owner, came out and Porter told him, "Go back in and tell them to come out with their hands up." He did, but it was several minutes before the door opened again. A large man appeared with a pistol in his hand. It was Lot Huntington, a Mormon. He came from one of the most respected families in the territory and was good-looking, adventurous and well-known. But to Porter the law was the law, and it fell on Mormon and non-Mormon alike. This was not to be a situation much different from many others in the future or the past. There was no bargaining or compromise because of who he was or who his folks were. Porter looked upon him as a horse thief, and he was there to make an arrest. They both knew each other, and both were fearless. Porter demanded that he throw down his gun and be taken in to face the law. Lot turned and made a dash to the stable and jumped on Brown Sal, the stolen horse. As he came out, he raised his gun, but Rockwell pulled the trigger on his gun first, and Huntington fell dead. The 2 others that were with Huntington came out and surrendered. Porter brought them into Salt Lake City and turned them over to the police. A short time later, Porter heard gunfire and ran to where he heard the shots. The police were near the bodies of the 2 men, and one said they tried to escape. This event, of course, disproved many reports of the apostates and critics because the facts were evident that Porter shot a Mormon and brought 2 others into the law. Porter was not just shooting Gentiles as they had claimed. They would have to change their tactics, and they did. The anti-Mormon Stenhouse wrote, "All the bad and desperate Mormons were not brought to judgment, but the pretext alone was wanting for carrying more extensively into execution the general police program." Resistance to an officer, or the slightest attempt to escape from custody, was eagerly seized, when wanted, as the justification of closing a disreputable career, and in more than one case of this legal shooting, there is much doubt if even the trivial excuse was waited for. The Salt Lake police then earned the reputation of affording every desperate prisoner the opportunity of escape, and, if embraced, the officer's ready revolver brought the fugitive to a halt and saved the county the expenses of a trial and his subsequent boarding in the penitentiary. A coroner's inquest and cemetery expenses were comparatively light. Rocky Mountain Saints, page 419. These anti-Mormon elements would have screamed much louder if the criminals would have been Gentiles. And surely they would have been much happier if the criminals would have escaped the Mormons. William A. Bill Hickman became an apostate of no minor consequence. His efforts to crush Mormondom and destroy Brigham Young were among the heaviest assaults ever plotted by the apostates and the anti-Mormon element. In 1871, Hickman conspired with a federal marshal who was attempting to bring about the downfall of Brigham Young and the Mormon hierarchy. Marshal Sam Gilson spoke earnestly and convincingly to the man he had spent weeks attempting to contact. What the lawman wanted was a full confession of the outlaw's misdeeds. He especially wanted knowledge of a major crime which could be linked to the Mormon hierarchy. In return, Gilson promised to use his influence in the informer's behalf. The marshal's impassioned arguments eventually prevailed, and the desperado nodded his assent. Orrin Porter Rockwell, by Schindler, page 352. Thus, Bill Hickman became involved in the plot of revenge against Brigham Young, as most apostates were doing. Gilson went through the formalities of arresting Hickman on the charge of murder and took him to Camp Douglas. For the next 2 weeks, Hickman wrote his famous confession, which was later used by the federal courts to indict Brigham Young and other church leaders. On October 28, Daniel H. Wells and Hosea Stout were arrested for complicity in the murder of Richard Yates during the Utah War of 1857. William Kimball was arrested for being an accessory to the murder of the last member of the Aiken Party, and Brigham Young was also named in that indictment. Hickman was listed as co-defendant. 3 months later, the United States Supreme Court handed down a decision in the Engelbrecht case, which set aside all of the legal proceedings in Utah on all cases in Utah for 18 months prior to that time. This would make null and void the indictments against about 140 people, including those against Young, Wells, Stout, Kimball, and even Hickman himself. If blood atonement were always being committed upon the apostates as some claimed, why didn't Brigham Young send Porter to atone William Law, who was the leader of the mob that killed Joseph Smith? He was the worst of all the apostates, yet he lived to an old age and died a natural death. Why didn't Porter get sent around the valley and wipe out all the apostates who were constantly writing and preaching against Mormonism? The most vicious slanders written against Mormons came from the pens of men who lived among the Mormons all their lives. If blood atonement were practiced upon those Mormons on the inner circle who were betrayers or apostates, why didn't Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball have Porter blood atone their own 2 sons who apostatized and left for California? Some anti-Mormons say that blood atonement was a Mormon doctrine and was administered as a penalty for apostasy. Why did Porter administer it upon murderers, horse thieves, and bank robbers who were often Gentiles? He was functioning in his office as a marshal, not as an administrator of blood atonement. Conversely, if Mormons believed in atoning the Gentiles, why did Porter shoot down so many of the Mormons? The whole fabric of the critics was woven with inconsistency, fable, and rumor. If Porter shot a man in self-defense, no one should dispute his innocence. If he shot a horse thief who resisted arrest, then the law also justified his actions. If a man is shot when committing a murder, a rape, or some other atrocious crime, the law contends that it is a justifiable homicide. If Porter Rockwell did all of these, then he stands as innocent as any other man who did them. If he did these things 1,000 times, he is still justified as such as if he had done them only once. The American public has watched on television Matt Dillon shoot outlaws on Gunsmoke every week for nearly 20 years with contented approval. They do not condemn their hero because they saw all the facts and incidents that led up to the villains being killed. This is the missing segment in many of the clashes that marshals have with criminals. Such conditions existed with Porter and many other gunfighters throughout the Old West. Once in a court, the judge asked Porter how many men he had killed. After a little thought, he admitted that he didn't know, but knowing the concern of the court, he quickly added, "I never shot a man that didn't deserve it." On June 11, 1878, less than a year after the death of Brigham Young, the newspapers carried the news of the death of Orrin Porter Rockwell. After attending the theater in Salt Lake City with his daughter, Mary, he began to have a series of heart attacks. He passed away with little suffering at age 65. For nearly all of those years he was sought. Porter was one of the first converts when the church was organized, and when he died, he had been a member longer than anyone else. He was not only a distant cousin to Joseph Smith, but was also a distant cousin to Abraham Lincoln. Although Porter was not the usual sort of family man, he did have 4 wives and 15 children. However, his work demanded most of his time. Whatever may be said of Porter, perhaps no one had a more profound insight into his real character than the prophet Joseph Smith, who wrote in August 1842, "There is a numerous host of faithful souls I could wish to record in the book of the law of the Lord, but time and chance would fail. I will mention therefore only a few of them, as emblematic of those who are too numerous to be written. But there is one that I would mention, namely Orrin Porter Rockwell, who is now a fellow wanderer with myself, an exile from his home, because of the numerous deeds and the infernal, fiendish dispositions of the indefatigable and unrelenting hand of the Missourians. He is an innocent and noble boy, may God Almighty deliver him from the hands of his pursuers. He is an innocent and noble child, and my soul loves him. Let this be recorded forever and ever. Let this be the blessing of salvation and honor to his portion." Mill, Star, 19750.